August 21st, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, midnight. The humid air was thick with the smell of salt and jungle rot as the rain began to fall in slow, heavy drops. Somewhere beyond the black wall of trees, a lone Marine sentry from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines squinted through the darkness. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and the low rumble of distant thunder. But then, beneath it, he heard something new. The sound of boots. Many boots. He raised his Springfield rifle, eyes straining toward the tree line along the Tenaru River. A glint of metal flashed in the lightning, a bayonet, a helmet, and then a shout in Japanese. Within seconds, the jungle erupted. From the darkness poured hundreds of Imperial Japanese soldiers, veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya, charging headlong across the sandbar with bayonets fixed and cries of "Banzai" echoing over the surf. The Marines opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning strikes, the roar of M1917 Brownings thundering over the sound of the rain. Tracers tore across the dark river, slicing through ranks of men charging. Without fear, Private First Class Al Schmid swung his Browning .30 caliber into position, his hands slick with sweat. "They're coming fast," he shouted over the roar. His loader slammed another belt into the feed tray. Schmid pressed the trigger and sent a stream of red tracers slicing through the black. Men fell in waves, yet still they came. Hundreds of them howling, leaping into the river, firing as they charged. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin A. Pollock barked orders to hold the line. This was the first major test of the Marines' defense of Guadalcanal, an island they barely controlled. The Japanese wanted it back, and they were coming with everything they had. The Tenaru River became a killing ground. Grenades arced through, the darkness splashing into the shallows before erupting in plumes of mud and water. Mortar rounds screamed down, lighting the night in bursts of orange and white. Men fought at such close range that the smell of cordite and blood fused into one choking haze. By dawn, the beachhead was carpeted with bodies. The tide carried dozens of Japanese soldiers back out to sea, rifles still clutched in their hands. Schmid's hands were blistered and raw, but his gun never cooled. When the firing finally stopped, the Marines realized what they had done. They had annihilated an entire Japanese assault battalion. As the sun rose over the steaming jungle, the men of the 1st Marine Division looked out over a scene of devastation. They were exhausted, filthy, and hungry, but they were still standing. Guadalcanal wasn't just another island. It was the first Allied foothold in the Pacific, and the Japanese Empire wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The Marines didn't know it yet, but the Battle of the Tenaru was just the beginning. Before long, the sky above Guadalcanal would burn with fire, and the waters around it would run red with ships and men. For 6 months, this small, jungle-covered island would become hell on earth. August 22nd, 1942, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The dawn mist still hung low over the clearing when the Marines heard the first distant hum of engines. Men instinctively froze. It was a sound they had learned to fear, the deep, rising growl of Japanese bombers approaching from the north. "Hit the deck," someone shouted. Within seconds, the sky erupted. Dozens of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers swept over the island in tight formation, escorted by nimble Zero fighters. The bombs whistled down like banshees, exploding in great geysers of dirt across the newly captured airstrip. Marines dove for the foxholes, covering their heads as shrapnel screamed through the palms. The Japanese knew what the Marines knew. Henderson Field was the key to everything. Whoever controlled it controlled the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. The airfield had been only half finished when the Marines landed earlier that month. Now it was their lifeline, a single strip of pitted coral and crushed rock carved from the jungle by Japanese engineers, seized by the Marines in the opening days of the invasion. They named it after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Captain John L. Smith of VMF 223 stood beside his F-4F Wildcat, listening to the bombs fall. His squadron, barely 24 fighters, was all that stood between the island and annihilation from the air. He glanced at the fuel drums stacked beside the runway, each one precious. "If they hit those, we're done," he muttered. When the raid finally ended, black smoke curled from the edge of the strip. Several Wildcats were burning, but most had survived. The ground crews immediately scrambled to fill craters, patch up holes, and get the fighters back in the air. There was no rest. The Japanese would return. They always did. That night, Henderson Field was alive with movement. Marines worked under the moonlight, repairing revetments and unloading crates of ammunition. Supplies were already running low. The Navy had pulled back after the disastrous Battle of Savo Island 2 weeks earlier. 4 Allied cruisers sunk in a single night. The Marines on Guadalcanal were on their own. Canned rations ran out first. Then medical supplies. The men lived on captured Japanese rice and whatever they could scavenge. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion spread through the ranks faster than any enemy assault. But still, they held Henderson Field. Each day followed the same rhythm. Dawn raids, frantic repairs, constant tension. When the Cactus Air Force, the scrappy, understrength Marine and Navy squadrons stationed there, finally lifted off, the men on the ground would pause, watching as the Wildcats clawed their way into the sky. Then, moments later, they'd hear the clash above the island, the rattle of machine guns, the scream of diving aircraft, and the dull crump of bombs. To the Marines below, every fighter that came back was a small miracle. By September, the Japanese had begun sending reinforcements nightly. Transports crept down the slot, a narrow stretch of water between the Solomon Islands, unloading troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. The Marines could hear the engines offshore, could see the silhouettes of barges slipping away at dawn. They called it the Tokyo Express. And every night the enemy grew stronger, but the Marines dug in deeper, trenches carved into red clay, machine gun pits shielded with sandbags, barbed wire laced through the trees. Henderson Field wasn't just an airstrip anymore, it was a fortress, a symbol. If the Japanese took it, the Pacific would be theirs again. If the Marines held it, it could turn the tide of the war, and soon that tide was about to come crashing down on them. September 12, 1942, south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. A grey dawn mist clung to the jungle canopy, heavy with the stench of decay and gun oil. Below the ridgeline, the Marines of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson's first raider, battalion crouched silently in their foxholes, staring into the dark green tangle ahead. They knew something was coming. They could feel it in the air, an electricity that made every leaf seem to tremble. For 2 days, scouts had reported increased Japanese movement through the jungle. Intercepted messages suggested a major assault was imminent. Edson had been ordered to hold a low, exposed ridgeline, really 2 small hills running east to west, just south of Henderson Field. To his men it was simply the ridge. If the Japanese broke through here, Henderson Field would fall, and with it, Guadalcanal. The first mortar shells came at dusk. The jungle exploded in fire and smoke as the Japanese opened up with everything they had: artillery, mortars, and machine guns. The Marines hugged the dirt as shrapnel ripped through palm trunks and tore the night apart. Then, through the chaos, came the cries, "Banzai! Banzai!" Wave after wave of Japanese infantry surged up the slope, bayonets glinting in the flicker. of explosions. Edson's raiders met them head-on. Barrs and Thompsons roared, cutting down charging figures that kept coming, even as bodies piled up around them. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the sickly sweet rot of the jungle. Private First Class Charles Jackson, barely 20, gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles went white. The man next to him screamed as a grenade exploded, showering them both with mud and blood. Jackson didn't think. He just fired, again and again, until the barrel smoked in his hands. By midnight, the Marines were nearly overrun. Edson moved among the lines, shouting encouragement, dragging wounded men back to cover, rallying the living. "We're pulling back to the knoll," he ordered. "We'll hold there or die here." The raiders and parachute Marines withdrew to the final defensive line atop the small hill overlooking Henderson Field. Below them, the Japanese regrouped for another charge. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded and the roar of enemy bugles. When the next wave hit, it was like the earth itself rose against them. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stormed uphill, silhouetted by the fires burning below. The Marines fired point blank. Hand grenades tumbled down the slope like rain. Machine guns overheated, jammed, and were cleared again in seconds. Edson, standing upright in the open, calmly directed fire like a man possessed. "Don't give them an inch," he bellowed. "Not 1 inch." By dawn on September 13th, the last Japanese charge broke against the hill. When the firing stopped, the slope was littered with over 800 enemy dead. The survivors melted back into the jungle. The Marines sat in silence, numb and shaking. Some wept. Others simply stared at the bodies below, at the cost of one night's survival. Red Mike. Edson walked the line, blood spattered across his uniform, exhaustion etched into his face. Henderson Field still stood behind them, safe for now. For his leadership that night, Edson would later receive the Medal of Honor. But in that moment, there was no glory, only the realization that Guadalcanal was becoming something more than a battle. It was a war of endurance, and for the next few months, the island itself would test the limits of human endurance. October 13th, 1942. Ironbottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. The night was eerily calm when the first shells came. At 1:30 a.m., the sea to the north erupted in orange flashes as two massive Japanese battleships, Congo and Haruna, opened fire. Their 14-inch guns hurled shells the size of oil drums toward Guadalcanal, each one screaming through the night sky before slamming into the island with a sound like the world tearing apart. On the ridge above Henderson Field, Marines threw themselves to the ground as the bombardment began. Trees shattered like matchsticks. Fuel drums exploded in fireballs that lit the jungle in flickering hellish orange. The airfield itself was hammered relentlessly, runways cratered, planes shredded, bomb dumps ignited. Sergeant Paul Red Horton of the 164th Infantry remembered it years later. It wasn't just artillery. It was like being inside a furnace. You could feel the pressure in your chest, every blast pushing the air out of your lungs. For nearly 90 minutes the bombardment continued, one of the heaviest of the entire Pacific War. The earth shook, the horizon burned. When the guns finally fell silent, Henderson Field was a ruin. Craters pocked the runway. Aircraft lay twisted and broken. Dozens of Marines were dead or wounded. Then came the second wave, the air attacks. At dawn, Japanese bombers swept in from Rabaul, pounding what remained of the airfield. Smoke curled high into the humid morning sky. The defenders could do little but fire their machine guns skyward and pray. Yet somehow, by noon, the Cactus Air Force was flying again. Ground crews, blackened with soot, filled craters with sandbags, dragged wrecked planes off the strip, and patched together whatever aircraft they could. Pilots took off with bullet holes in their wings, engines coughing smoke. Captain Joe Foss, commanding VMF 121, climbed into his F4F Wildcat, teeth clenched. He'd been awake for nearly 2 days straight, but there was no rest, not while the enemy still had the skies. "We'll hold this damn island," he muttered over the radio, "even if it's just me and a shovel." That afternoon, Foss shot down 3 bombers over the island. His kills lifted morale, but everyone knew what was coming next. The Japanese were preparing a full-scale offensive. Offshore, the Tokyo Express was running almost nightly now. Destroyers and fast transports darted down the slot, landing fresh troops at Tassafaronga under cover of darkness. The Marines called them night mail deliveries, each one bringing more soldiers to kill them. By mid-October, there were over 20,000 Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. In contrast, the Marines were running out of everything: food, ammunition, and strength. They ate captured rice mixed with canned meat, slept in soaked trenches, and lived under constant threat of attack. Malaria swept through the ranks. Men's faces turned gaunt, eyes hollow. They moved like ghosts, driven by routine and survival. But the spirit of defiance never died. Every day they held Henderson Field. They denied Japan control of the skies. Every plane that lifted off from that battered strip carried the hope of the entire Pacific War. And as the Japanese prepared for one last massive push to retake Guadalcanal, the Marines, tired, sick, and half-starved, tightened their grips on their rifles and waited. They'd survived the sea of fire. Now they would face the storm of flesh and steel. October 24th, 1942. Lunga Ridge, Guadalcanal. The rain had been falling for days, thick, unrelenting sheets that turned the jungle floor into a swamp of red mud. The Marines of the 1st Division were soaked to the bone, rifles rusting in their hands, uniforms rotting on their backs. The smell of decay and sickness clung to everything. But through the downpour came the whispers. "They're coming tonight." Across the Matanikau River, Japanese forces, over 7,000 strong under General Harukichi Hyakutake, were massing for their decisive assault. Their orders were simple: smash through the American lines, seize Henderson Field, and drive the invaders into the sea. The Marines waited in silence, their trenches filled with water, fingers tightening around cold steel. Among them was Sergeant John Basilone of the 7th Marines, commanding a section of heavy machine guns. He had spent the day reinforcing his position, laying extra belts of ammunition, digging deeper, setting overlapping fields of fire. When night fell, the jungle exploded. The first Japanese mortars screamed overhead, bursting among the palm trees in violent flashes. Then came the infantry, hundreds of them, charging through the darkness, bayonets fixed, shouting "Tenno Haika Banzai" as they hurled themselves against the Marine lines. Basilone's guns opened up, the twin barrels of his water-cooled. Brownings glowed red as he swept them across the front. "Keep it coming!" he yelled as his assistant gunners fed belts of ammunition through the chattering weapons. Spent casings piled up around his boots, steam hissing from the barrels in the rain. The Japanese charged again and again, sometimes crawling through the mud, sometimes screaming as they charged over the bodies of their own dead. Basilone's men fought until their guns burned out. Then he ran through enemy fire to grab spare parts and ammunition from another position, carrying them back alone through the chaos. By dawn, his section had repelled wave after wave, inflicting catastrophic losses. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of his position. The Marines had held the line, but barely. For his heroism that night, John Basilone would become the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. But he never saw himself as a hero. "We just did what we had to do," he said later. "You hold the line, or you die. Across the island, similar stories unfolded. The Japanese attacks broke against the American defenses like waves against a cliff, each one weaker than the last. Exhausted, starving, and plagued by disease, their momentum finally began to falter. Then came the turning point. On November 12th, a massive Japanese naval task force approached to bombard Henderson Field again. But this time the U.S. Navy didn't retreat. Under Admiral William Bull Halsey's orders, every available ship steamed toward Guadalcanal to intercept. What followed was the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a brutal close-range night fight in Ironbottom Sound. Cruisers and destroyers clashed at point-blank range, their guns firing so close the shockwaves shattered glass on their own bridges. Searchlights cut through the smoke. Torpedoes streaked through the water. Ships burned from bow to stern. When dawn came, the sea was littered with wrecks and oil fires. But Henderson Field still stood. For the first time, the Japanese Navy turned back. By February 1943, after 6 months of grinding combat, the Imperial Japanese Army finally evacuated the island. What began as a desperate fight for survival had become one of the most decisive victories of the Pacific War. When the last Marines walked the length of Henderson Field, now quiet except for the hum of engines and the cry of seabirds, they understood what they had achieved. Guadalcanal wasn't just another battle, it was the moment when the tide turned. From that day forward, Japan would be on the defensive. The long, brutal march across the Pacific had begun, and it started here, on a forgotten jungle island the world thought was lost. The Marines had fought, starved, bled, and buried their own in the red clay of Guadalcanal, but they had held, and in doing so, they had changed the course of history.